A morning thick with fog. A horn ripped through the silence. On the slick rails cutting across Redwood Ridge, a 4-month-old shepherd pup named Ranger wavered, trapped in the glare of a growing light. He was never meant to live another 10 seconds. But out of the pines stepped Boone McAllister, a former cavalryman who carried both scars and silence. His boots struck the gravel with purpose, breath steady, a promise already set in motion. No one had expected him. No one believed he could reach the dog in time. Yet he knew what it meant to stand in the narrow space between fear and fate. What happened next would stir tears because some moments rewrite lives. And remind us that second chances aren't just for strays, but for soldiers and for entire towns. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your hometown in the comments. And if you believe no human or animal should ever be abandoned, hit subscribe. This story may just restore your faith in miracles. Redwood Ridge woke to a hush older than the town itself. A mountain hush made of cold pine breath and the deep, patient thrum of steel in the distance. Dawn hadn't quite arrived. It was milk-white and heavy. Mist hung like a shawl over Douglas fir and red cedar, the air damp enough to bead on lashes and swallow sound into whispers. The single track carved straight through the forest gleamed with a slick sheen, twin ribbons of steel trembling under dew. Beyond the tree line, the town still dozed. Pitched roofs sent curls of smoke into the fog, and the dark outline of the grain elevator kept its watch as it had for a century. Out here on the edge of wilderness and waking streets, the air smelled of rain not yet fallen, and the hidden green of moss. Ranger was too small for a world this vast. 4 months is hardly time to learn a mountain's language. He had gathered it in fragments, the way pine needles snag at your paws, the way owls ask questions you cannot answer, the courage it takes to last a night outside, when every shadow feels like teeth. All knees and paws still clumsy. His ears too big for his head, one tilted forward like a question, the other askew as though listening for an answer. His smoky black and gray coat carried the grime of the forest. Burrs tangled in the feathering on his legs. A smear of mud streaked his flank like a careless brushstroke. His amber eyes, ringed with green gold, held the twin chords of every pup hunger and hope. He hadn't eaten since last night, when a door left ajar, and a swirl of scents led him chasing until chasing turned into being lost. Lost turned into the long, trembling dark. But he had a name, and a name is a tether. Ranger had learned his name as a warm sound in a warm kitchen, spoken by hands scented faintly of flour and lemon soap. Lila Rose McKenna's voice could pull him from any dream. He knew its gentleness, the way it lifted into laughter when he skittered after a sponge, the way it sank into patient warning when he gnawed at forbidden laces. Lila Rose was tall, willow slender, her presence quiet but sure. Long limbs moved with a grace carved by years on her feet in McKenna's market. The small shop once run by her late husband, Wyatt McKenna. His death had etched sorrow into her face, pale parentheses at her mouth, a line of yearning between her brows. Yet tenderness never left her voice. Last night, while the town slept under the heavy dark, she had searched with a flashlight until its beam grew weak. Calling soft, then fierce, then soft again. Each breath leaving silver ghosts in the air. Ranger. And again. As if saying it twice might summon the pup from fog and longing. Coyotes answered with laughter, but not her dog. By morning his legs dragged, his belly ached, and the forest, once a playground at dusk, had turned into a dense story, written in strange punctuation. He followed the only sentence left to him, creosote iron, and old rain braided into a trail that pulled his nose downhill until the trees thinned and the gravel shoulder pricked his tender pads. The rails were colder than anything he'd ever felt, a chill that leapt from paw to bone. He paced the edge, head-low claws skittering on crushed stone. In the distance, something breathed a long, steady exhale that swelled and vanished beyond the wall of fog. He couldn't name it. He only knew the sound kept coming, and the rails themselves hummed with a note sharp enough to reach his teeth. He should have turned back. He should have slipped into the undergrowth to find shelter under boughs meant for small bodies. But hunger shouts loud in young dogs, and confusion speaks even louder. So he set one paw on the rail, then another. The cold shot up into his chest like a cruel surprise, and he took 2 shaky steps just as the faraway blaze of a headlight pierced the mist. The sound came again and again, and the rails seemed to hum with a vibration that rattled in Ranger's teeth. He should have backed away. He should have slipped into the brush and found shelter under branches that cradle small creatures. But hunger shouts loud to a puppy, and so does confusion. He set one paw on the near rail, then the other. The shock of cold shot through his chest like a jolt. He staggered forward 2 shaky steps just as a halogen eye blinked into life far down the line. Across the way, hidden where the trees grew dark as night, a man moved along a deer path with the silence of long practice, the kind of quiet learned from years of carrying noise inside his body. His stride was steady, the gait of someone who wanted to feel the mountain underfoot. Not to conquer it, but to be weighed by it. His name was Boone McAllister, 41. Tall and hard-built, broad-shouldered, but lean, his skin weathered to a light tan. His gray-blue eyes steady beneath neatly parted dark hair, shot through with strands of gray. A stubble beard traced his jawline. His face carried the look of a man forever caught mid-decision. He wore one uniform day after day, woodland camouflage fatigues, sleeves rolled tight. His name stitched in faded thread, a utility belt at his waist, coyote-brown boots scuffed from miles of use. He had walked this way for months, treading the ground between his cabin and the ridgeline, letting the wind, the slope, and the blunt wisdom of ravens wear down the ache that woke him before the sun. There are wounds the world can see and stitch, and there are the other kind folded neatly under uniform, then t-shirt, then skin. Boone carried both kinds. The mountain in its hard mercy didn't ask which was which. He came out early because sleep had arrived too late, and because old habits keep a man company when nothing else will. He walked with purpose, not drifting, noting deer tracks scuffed into the dirt bark, torn up where a black bear had dug for grubs, the sharp cut of air rising from creek mist. He read the weather. He read the wind. He let the forest do the talking until something not of the forest claimed the air. First a horn, so far it felt like memory. Then the long breath of steel rolling ahead of it, pushing the fog into a shallow silver river that slid across the ground. Boone stopped cold. You don't grow up in a railroad town without learning the language of rails, and you don't spend a dozen years in the cavalry without learning to read a field for what doesn't belong. The out-of-place thing today was small, low and crooked movement, where there should have been only gray. A shadow stumbling on slick iron. He froze, nostrils flaring. The scent of creosote and oil, the mineral tang, the faint heat of metal carried from down the line where the engine shouldered through the bend. He smelled, too, his own fear, a sourness that had lingered since midnight and woven through it a thread of memory soap and kitchen air and cedar chests at the foot of a bed. Lila rose. The thought slipped out in a sound low in his throat, like a call that once would have brought footsteps, the scrape of a chair, a smile. "There you are. Good boy." But what answered instead was the horn again louder, now a warning stretched so long the fog itself shivered. The rail beneath his boots trembled, and the light swelling at the curve no longer blinked. At that same hour, Lila Rose McKenna stood on her porch, a thermos of forgotten coffee in hand, her cheeks stung by cold, a reflective vest over her sweater keys clenched in her palm. She was not a woman who panicked. Life had drilled that out of her, one steady day at a time. But this was something else. This was the drumbeat that forces the body to move even after the muscles quit. In person, she looked younger than the grief she carried. Late 40s, slim and tall, her hair twisted into a practical knot that always betrayed her by noon. Her mouth kept a firm line for business licenses, propane refills, and freezer repairs, but her hazel-green eyes never lost their softness. Since winter, she had learned that kindness was not weakness, but survival, and she refused to let it go. She locked her door, though nothing inside mattered, but silence she could not stand. She whispered the name like a prayer, and stepped into the mist, into a town gentled by fog that hid all the places where she had once said goodbye. At the edge of the right-of-way, Boone stepped from tree shadow to brush and brush to gravel. He moved with that paradoxical mix of speed and economy, the body's wisdom learned from making decisions faster than thought. His mind ran the quick math: how fast, how far, what stood in the way. Half a mile to the bend, seconds once the engine cleared it. He marked the blackberry brambles crowding shoulder-high along both sides of the track. Not enough to stop him, but plenty to snare a puppy. He strained for other sounds. Voices, the bark of a searching dog, the crash of someone forcing through brush. Nothing. Only the horn sharper now, and the thin, desperate breaths of a pup trying hard to be brave. Boone McAllister cupped his hands to his mouth and let out a sound he hadn't used in years, but never truly forgotten, a low whistle that rose into a quick chirp. The kind meant to turn panic into attention for a young animal. Ranger's head snapped toward the sound, ears pricked like antennae eyes suddenly lit with interest. Instinct carried him toward it, as if courage could be borrowed from a stranger's voice. If heaven had humor, it was here a battle-hardened soldier held at the whim of a 4-month-old pup. Boone almost smiled, himself a private flicker of wonder that the world could still surprise him. "Easy," he called, voice pitched soft but firm, layered with alertness. "Easy, buddy." He glanced back down the line. The light was no longer a speck, it was a fist of white heat, and the rail beneath it carried a shimmer of coming fire. With more time, he could have circled wide, cut the pup off from danger. But time wasn't his to have. His body did the math it already knew: angle, distance, weight, the way gravel gives and steel never does. The reach of his arms. Some moments are forged out of all the ones before. He had been built for this: I run, I lift, I shield. Once in sand-colored places, he had done it for men with families waiting. Ranger took another step drawn by that voice, though the scent was not home. His hind paw slipped from the round crown of the rail. He pinwheeled clumsily, claws scrabbling for grip that wasn't there. The horn split the fog. The track itself hummed in a key meant for bones. Boone's heart locked into an old metronome: now, now, now. The mountain morning tried to hold its pretense, the steady tick of a hemlock mist rising enough to show pale bellies of cottonwoods along the creek lights flickering on in town like a string of worried stars. Boone stepped forward, gravel cracking under his boots. The fog peeled back just enough to show him more of the track, more of the pup, more of the merciless curve. "Hey!" he shouted again. At that sound, Ranger bowed, small and hopeful, as if about to tumble into a run. Boone raised his hand, palm outward, smoothing the air. Stay. His posture charged with old muscle memory, canine-handling combat drills, knees bent, core, braced eyes locked not on the pup, but on the space where he'd be in a heartbeat. Choice tipped into motion. Even the fog seemed to pause, thinning, as if to witness. Down track, the engine's halogen eye widened into a white coin without mercy. The horn poured its warning until the trees quaked. The rail sang like a live wire. The pup's paw slipped again, his chest pitching forward. One more step, and he'd be locked to the line of death. Boone exhaled once, slow, and moved. The rail roared, louder iron echoing through mist and forest. Gravel trembled under 1,000 tiny quakes as the beast rounded the bend with storm-like inevitability. Boone McAllister moved before thought could argue the body of a cavalry soldier, deciding where the mind only shouted. He exploded from the tree-line boots, hammering ballast, a blur of camouflage. His heart seized not with fear, but with precision. This is the run. This is the leap. This is the moment. Ranger slipped again, paws flailing for a grip on cold steel, a half-yelp, half-cry, tearing the mist. Boone's calloused hands found him with a certainty older than choice. He scooped the pup in one swift motion, tucking him to his chest as he once hauled comrades to safety. His body twisted mid-air, boots biting gravel as the train screamed past. The wind off the locomotive was a living monster ripping at cloth and hair, roaring ancient thunder into his ears. Steel wheels shrieked, the ground quaked, gravel and dust flew, but inside Boone's arms, Ranger shook in safety. The pup pressed his muzzle into the soldier's chest, whimpering, his tiny frame rattling with aftershock. The train thundered on car after car, pounding the rails until the very air bent beneath it. Boone hunched his shoulders a shield bones, rattling the storm, slashing his cheek. Only when the last car had torn past did silence return, raw ringing, a silence that felt almost holy. Boone lowered his gaze. Ranger lifted his head. Amber eyes wide, not only terrified, but filled with a stunned awe, as if he already knew this man had chosen him over everything else. From the edge of the meadow, a small voice broke the hush. Daisy May Carter stood there clutching a basket of wildflowers in one hand, a daisy crown half-finished in the other. At 7 years old, she carried the restless curiosity of a child, always hunting for the edge of the world. She was tall for her age, all elbows and knees, her sun-browned hair tangled in the breeze, freckles scattered across a face shaped by days outdoors. Her green eyes, usually lit with wonder, were now stretched wide with shock. Daisy May belonged to Redwood Ridge, daughter of a carpenter father and a mother who sewed uniforms and curtains alike. Folks said she had inherited her grandmother's stubborn streak, though in that moment she simply stood frozen, her lips parted in awe. She had wandered from her mother's garden, skipping down the path that led to the old tracks, humming while she picked blossoms. She had bent to gather violets when the horn cut the mist. Lifting her head, she expected a deer only to see the pup tottering on the rails and a man charging like lightning. Now, with the air still trembling from the train's rage, she clutched her basket tighter, staring at the scene before her. A soldier, kneeling a pup, pressed tight against his chest, both wrapped in the fragile quiet of survival. Boone McAllister exhaled hard, chest rising and falling as he tried to steady the surge of adrenaline. He slid his thumb down the pup's back, murmuring in a voice meant for frightened children. "Easy now, little guy. You're all right. You're safe." The words were low, softened by relief, but edged with command. Ranger's trembling eased a little, his small paws gripping Boone's blouse, as if it were the only anchor in the world. Daisy May stepped forward cautiously, her small boots crunching damp gravel. She had seen Boone before in town, always at a distance. To her he was the quiet soldier from the cabin by the ridge, The man people whispered about who slipped in for supplies and left before anyone could draw him into talk. Grown-ups said the war had broken him, though Daisy May never knew what that meant. What she saw now wasn't a broken man. It was someone who had moved faster than the storm to save a life no one else could have reached. Her young heart burned the sight into memory, permanent as ink on paper. Boone noticed her only then gray-blue eyes narrowing slightly at the small figure peering through the mist. He gave a brief nod, not unkind, but restrained, as if words cost him more than action. Daisy May swallowed her whisper, carried by the quiet. "You saved him." Boone didn't answer right away. He looked down at Ranger, then back at her, a muscle tightening in his jaw. "Wasn't gonna let him die," he said finally. The roughness in his tone came more from habit than intention. His voice held steady, though worn with the rasp of a man who hadn't spoken much outside necessity. Daisy May's eyes followed the pup as Ranger licked Boone's sleeve, still shaking, but already burrowing in fear, giving way to trust. She took another step, courage stirring, and crouched low, her basket swaying. "What's his name?" she asked. Boone shook his head, scanning the trees as though waiting for an owner to appear. "Don't know," he admitted, "but he belongs to someone. Somebody's missing him." His hand brushed gently over the pup's head fingers, easing through the soft fur. Ranger's breathing slowed his tail, giving the faintest wag despite it all. The mist began to thin, as if the forest itself wanted the scene remembered. Shafts of sunlight broke through the canopy, dappling gravel fur and camouflage with gold. The rails gleamed wet, a harsh reminder of how close it had come to ending. Daisy May straightened her small frame, carrying a solemnity rare for her age. She knew she had witnessed something extraordinary, something she would carry home to her mother and later share with the whole of Redwood Ridge. But for now she stayed quiet, her daisy crown forgotten. Eyes locked on the soldier and the pup who clung to him as if the world had narrowed to that single pair of arms. Boone finally rose, cradling Ranger carefully to his chest. He swept the tree line once more before turning toward the woods. Daisy May didn't follow. Instinct told her this wasn't her place to intrude. She lingered at the meadow's edge basket, heavy in her hands. The image seared into her mind, the soldier, the pup, the mist split open by a train's fury. She whispered to herself, as though making it real. He saved him. Then she turned and ran for town, her small boots pattering on damp earth, carrying the story with her. The forest slipped back into quiet only after the train's thunder faded to memory, leaving the rails humming like a struck chord. The mist crept in again, veiling the trees in secrecy. Boone McAllister stood a moment longer on the gravel shoulder pulse, still hammering at a combat tempo. The pup stayed pressed against his chest. Ranger's small body still shook like a leaf caught in a storm, but the tremors had softened, no longer wild with panic, only the nervous shiver of a soul clinging to safety after brushing death. Boone McAllister lowered himself carefully, crouching by the rail's edge, where pine needles and damp moss carpeted the ground. He set the pup down on the grass, steadying him with one hand, as Ranger's legs wobbled weak from fear and exhaustion. His dark gray coat, mottled with lighter ash, was still damp from mist tufts sticking up where the tumble had ruffled him. Those golden brown eyes, wide as lanterns, locked on Boone with something raw, unfiltered, almost human. It wasn't just relief. It was recognition. A primal understanding that this man had stepped between him and annihilation. Boone's voice, roughened by years of silence and more suited to giving orders than comfort, dropped into a whisper meant only for the pup. "You're safe now, pup," he murmured, his palm sliding down the trembling back fingers, brushing burrs and clumps of dirt. Ranger let out a low whine that melted into a sigh, his head pressing into Boone's hand, as if the weight of trust had already been settled. For the first time in years, something eased in Boone's chest, an uncoiling no whiskey or solitude had ever managed. The pup leaned against his boot tail, wagging once tentative, as though testing whether joy was still allowed so soon after terror. Boone's mouth twitched into the faintest smile before his gaze shifted toward the tree line. A flash of movement reminded him they hadn't been alone. Daisy Mae Carter was gone already, her small figure darting back toward town like a messenger carrying a story too big to keep. Boone rose, brushing pine needles from his trousers, then scooped Ranger into his arms again with the grunt of old habit. "Let's get you out of this mess," he muttered, half to the pup, half to himself. His boots crunched over damp earth as he turned toward the deer path, winding deeper into the forest leading back to the modest cabin he'd claimed as refuge since discharge. The pup settled into his chest, trembling less now, eyelids heavy with the exhaustion of spent fear. Meanwhile, down the slope, where mist thinned toward the first cluster of Redwood Ridge cottages, Daisy Mae's small boots slapped against the dirt road. Her breath came fast, not from fear, but from urgency, her basket of wildflowers bouncing against her side. She tore through a yard where chickens scattered past a peeling white fence until she reached the clapboard house, where her mother was hanging linens on a rope between two apple trees. Josie Bell Rollins looked up startled as her daughter barreled into the yard. 35, she carried herself, with the quiet assurance of someone who had learned resilience the hard way. Tall and lean, her dark hair tied back in a simple braid, wisps escaping at her temples. Her brown eyes, steady and warm, were a comfort patients clung to at the small medical clinic where she worked. Widowed young, she had raised Daisy Mae largely on her own, her gentleness forged from grief and necessity. Emily, she began, but caught herself, lips closing around the clothespin she held. Daisy Mae. Her daughter's urgency told her more than words. The basket dropped at her feet as words tumbled out in a rush. "Mama, you won't believe it by the tracks. A puppy and the man from the cabin, the soldier, he saved it, Josie." Belle blinked, the clothespin slipping into the grass. She crouched to her daughter's level, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Slow down, sweetheart. Tell me again." Daisy Mae's green eyes glowed with the light. Only children carry when telling wonders. The train was coming, and there was a puppy on the tracks. He was so small, Mama shaking, and then Boone McAllister ran and picked him up just before the train came. It was so close, I thought they both— She stopped, shivering at the thought, then steadied herself. But he saved him. Josie Bell's heart tightened not only at the image her daughter painted, but at the mention of the man himself. She knew Boone at least by reputation. Everyone in Redwood Ridge did. He was the soldier who had come home to silence, who lived in a cabin more like a forgotten outpost than a home. Folks said he kept to himself, spoke only when necessary, carrying shadows that didn't belong to this valley. Josie Bell had seen him once or twice at the clinic supplies, only bandages, antiseptic. Never anything personal. He always left quickly, gaze polite yet distant, as if eye contact might tether him to something he couldn't bear. Now her daughter's words hung in the cool morning air like a bell still ringing. A soldier saving a stray. Not the kind of story Redwood Ridge usually told. This was a town of routines. The mill, the market, the clinic, the school. Boone McAllister did not belong in its stories, except in whispers. Josie Bell folded the linen, slowly buying time for her racing thoughts. "That was brave of him," she said softly. her tone caught between awe and curiosity. And foolish, she added, because trains don't forgive mistakes. Yet respect crept unbidden into her voice, trembling at the edges. Daisy Mae Carter, unaware of her mother's thoughts, tugged at her sleeve. "Can we go see him? The puppy was so scared, Mama. I think maybe they both need someone." Josie Bell Rollins gave a faint smile, brushing a stray strand of hair from her daughter's forehead. Maybe she said, though she knew it wasn't that simple. Boone McAllister had wrapped himself in silence like armor, and armor isn't easy to unfasten. Still, the story pulled at her heart. Sometimes what cracked armor wasn't another soldier, but something small, lost, and fragile. Back in the forest, Boone reached his cabin, a modest build of weathered logs, and a patched tin roof standing in a clearing among tall pines. The door groaned as he pushed it open. The air inside smelled of cedar smoke and stale coffee. Setting Ranger gently on a wool blanket near the hearth, he crouched to examine the pup more closely. Tiny abrasions marked his front paw fur, scraped raw from stumbling against gravel. Nothing fatal, but enough to sting. Boone retrieved his first aid kit, hands steady. The old rhythm of training carrying him clean assess bandage. Those hands once bloodied on foreign soil now worked to save something far smaller, but no less alive. Amber eyes watched him with a trust too deep for words. When the bandage was tied, Ranger's tail wagged once. Tentative, grateful, before he curled on the blanket with a weary sigh. Boone leaned back on his heels and exhaled. The cabin stayed quiet, save for the crackle of settling wood. For the first time in years, silence didn't feel heavy. It felt companionable. Meanwhile, Lila Rose McKenna had been searching since dawn. Her boots dark with dew, her breath rising in anxious clouds along the forest's edge. In her early 40s, tall and slender people often mistook her upright bearing for strength. But grief had lengthened her posture. It wasn't ease, but discipline that kept her shoulders squared. Her long brown hair, faintly streaked with gray, was tied back in a knot, unraveling with every hurried step. Fine lines traced her face, not just from age, but from widowhood, from nights carved by silence and mornings stitched together with fragile routines. Her hazel eyes, once quick to laugh, now carried a muted weariness, the look of a woman who had learned to endure. Ranger had been her husband Wyatt McKenna's final gift before illness took him. The pup was meant to keep her company, to guard against the emptiness of the house. Losing him now felt like losing Wyatt all over again. She had scoured the paths near her cabin first, calling into the mist, her voice breaking with each cry. "Enter Ranger." Every silence after those calls deepened her panic. He'd been gone since last night. She had carried a lantern until her arm ached, but the darkness had swallowed him whole. Now, with morning fog pressing thick between the trees, her voice fell flat against damp silence. She pressed on boots snagging on roots, jeans soaked at the hem. Her hands scratched raw from brush. Her imagination betrayed her, no longer comfort from novels by firelight, but cruel pictures of Ranger lying hurt, or still. Then came the sound. A train whistle. Shrill, urgent, cut through the forest like a blade. Lila Rose froze, her whole body stiff, as if the sound itself had struck her. The echo rolled across the ridges, dragging dread with it. Her heart slammed against her ribs. A train meant danger. Ranger was small, curious. He could have wandered anywhere. The thought of him on the tracks, helpless, struck her like a blow. Panic drove her forward, stumbling faster through undergrowth, branches snapping her arms, unnoticed, scratches welling red. Her mind repeated one refrain. "Please let me find him. Please don't let it be too late." As her frantic search carried her deeper into the fog far away, Boone walked the deer path back toward his cabin. Ranger cradled securely in his arms. His steps were steady, each one measured with the precision of old habits. Even in solitude, Boone never merely walked, he patrolled. The cabin came into view in its small clearing, a log structure beneath a dull tin roof. The clearing smelled of wood smoke and earth, a scent Boone had come to know as peace. Ranger whimpered softly, still shaken. Boone murmured under his breath, deep and calm, the same tone he had once used to steady frightened soldiers. He set the pup gently onto a wool blanket near the fireplace and knelt beside him. Ranger's muddy little body quivered, his left forepaw scraped raw where the gravel had cut into tender flesh. His breathing was shallow, uneven, but those golden eyes tracked Boone McAllister's every move with a trust so immediate it startled him. Boone pulled a dented metal box from a shelf, his old field medic kit repurposed now for smaller battles. He opened it with the precision of a man who had performed these steps countless times before. Once the bodies beneath his hands had been bloodied comrades. Now it was a trembling pup. With steady hands he cleaned the scrape, dabbed antiseptic, and wrapped the paw in gauze. Ranger whimpered at the sting, but never pulled away, pressing into Boone's touch, instead tail twitching faintly beneath the blanket. The soldier paused, hands still. There was something grounding about this, the way such a small creature placed his whole survival into his care without question. Boone's voice dropped into a whisper, meant only for the pup. "You'll make it, little one. You're tougher than you look." His gray-blue eyes softened, the hardness of old battles easing for the first time in years. The cabin felt changed, filled with a companionship it hadn't known in a long time. Boone leaned back on his heels, watching, as Ranger licked tentatively at the edge of the bandage, then sighed and curled against the blanket. For a man used to silence pressing heavy, the presence of the pup shifted the air. The quiet no longer felt empty. It felt alive. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Lila Rose McKenna paused, bracing herself against a tree trunk. Her chest heaved, the whistle still echoing in her ears. She shut her eyes, forcing herself to think. The tracks were too far to reach quickly, but fear had already rooted itself. She couldn't stop, not until Ranger was back in her arms. The day pressed on. Mist lifted into pale sunlight, but her dread sharpened with every step. Somewhere in those woods, her pup was waiting, and she would not stop until she found him. By mid-morning, the fog blanketing Redwood Ridge began to thin sunlight streaking through the fir canopy and spilling across dirt lanes. The air held the damp chill of earlier hours, but shutters opened, neighbors greeted each other, and the scent of fresh bread drifted down Main Street. In a town like Redwood Ridge, news traveled faster than daylight. Today, it started with a 7-year-old running breathless through the lanes, clutching a basket of wilted flowers, eyes wide with wonder. Daisy Mae Carter had never been good at keeping secrets, especially ones that smelled of miracles. She told her mother, Josie Bell Rawlins, first blurting every detail between gulps of air. By the time Josie Bell guided her into the kitchen, Daisy Mae was already planning whom she'd tell next. Her wiry frame carried her door-to-door freckles, bright voice high with excitement as she repeated the story, the soldier, the pup, the train. How close it had been, how he'd pulled the little dog to safety at the very last second. By the time Daisy Mae reached Cora Bell Hannigan, who ran the general store, the tale had grown wings. Cora Bell, stout and sharp-eyed behind wire-rimmed glasses, prided herself on keeping the town's pulse through the gossip that crossed her counter. She listened intently, lips pursed, in a mix of surprise and curiosity. "That soldier?" she asked, disbelief sharpening her voice. "Yes." Daisy May insisted, curls bouncing. "Boone McAllister." He ran so fast, faster than the train almost, and scooped the puppy right off the tracks. The story spilled beyond the store. Eli, Harper the postman, heard it as he collected mail. A pair of loggers carried it down to the mill. By noon, the tale of Boone's rescue had threaded through Redwood Ridge like wildfire. Among those who heard it was Lila Rose McKenna. She had stopped searching just long enough to step into the market for water. Her hair was disheveled, her hazel eyes shadowed with exhaustion, when Cora Belle Hannigan leaned over the counter and whispered, "Lila! They say Boone McAllister pulled a pup off the tracks this morning." Lila froze. For a moment her breath caught her heart pounding with a new kind of hope. "What did you say?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she meant. Cora Belle repeated it softer this time. "Some girl saw it, said the pup was gray-black about the size of your Ranger." Lila didn't wait for more. She left her water behind, clutched her jacket close, and hurried out the door. Her long strides carried her up the road toward the ridge, uneven but swift. Each beat of her pulse carried the same prayer. Please let it be him. At the cabin tucked in the pines, Ranger lay curled on the wool blanket near the hearth. His bandaged paw rested across his snout as he drifted into sleep, his chest finally rising and falling steady. Boone McAllister sat close by, elbows on his knees, hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the pup with a focus he didn't quite understand. He had spent years watching men in his unit sleep between missions, breathing the fragile tether between exhaustion and survival. But watching this little dog, so small, so trusting, stirred something different in him. Something quieter, something nearly forgotten. The sudden knock at the cabin door startled them both. Ranger's ears perked, and Boone straightened the muscle in his jaw, tightening. Visitors were rare. He opened the door cautiously. Lila Rose McKenna stood there, her face pale. Strands of hair loose around her temples, hazel eyes burning with urgency. For a moment, neither spoke. Then her gaze fell past him and froze. Ranger, lifting his head from the blanket ears, pricked tail, wagging faintly at the sight of her. Lila Rose gasped, a hand flying to her mouth. "Ranger?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The pup scrambled up, clumsily hobbling on his bandaged paw, and padded toward the doorway. Lila Rose dropped to her knees, gathering him into her arms. He buried his muzzle against her shoulder, whimpering with relief, licking her collarbone, as if to reassure her he was real. She pressed her face into his fur, tears slipping free. "Oh, my boy, I thought I'd lost you." When she lifted her gaze again, she met Boone's eyes for the first time. Gray-blue, steady, guarded. His stance was firm, squared, yet there was a calm in his expression that softened the scars hardship had carved. Lila Rose hesitated. She had imagined this moment differently. Anger at whoever had found Ranger suspicion questions. But what she saw in Boone was neither arrogance nor claim, only a quiet steadiness that disarmed her. "I heard you saved him," she said at last, her voice low. Boone's shoulders shifted in the old reflex of a man deflecting praise. He was in trouble, he answered simply. Anyone would have done the same. But Lila Rose knew better. Not everyone would have risked the train. Not everyone would have carried him here, tended his wounds with such care. Her throat tightened when she glanced at the neat bandage on Ranger's paw. For a moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the rustle of pines outside and the soft crackle of the fire within. Lila Rose hugged Ranger tighter, then looked back at Boone. "Thank you." She said the words sincere, though her body still held the stiffness of caution. Boone gave a small nod, stepping back to let her decide whether to enter or leave. Lila Rose lingered on the threshold, torn between distrust of a man she barely knew and the gratitude she could not ignore. Ranger's contented sigh against her chest tipped the balance. She realized then that her pup had already accepted him. Ranger's calmness spoke louder than anything Boone could have said. Back in town, Daisy Mae Carter had already gathered a crowd near the schoolyard, retelling the rescue to children and adults alike. Her hands traced the leap, her green eyes shining with drama. He jumped right in front of the train, just like in the movies, and the puppy wasn't even scared after. He looked so happy in his arms. The listeners exchanged glances. Many had known Boone only as the man who avoided Main Street, the quiet soldier from the Ridge, who answered greetings with little more than a nod. Now they pictured him differently. For the first time, his silence began to turn into something else, respect. At his cabin, Boone leaned against the doorway, watching Lila Rose cradle her pup. He saw in her eyes the shadow of sorrow, but also the fierce tenderness of someone who had lost too much already and couldn't bear to lose more. For reasons he couldn't yet name, he felt a strange kinship with her. Two lives scarred differently, bound in that moment by the same pup. The week after Lila Rose McKenna found Ranger in Boone's cabin seemed to settle the town into a hush, as though everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Redwood Ridge always hummed with whispers about timber at the mill debts, unpaid children skipping school. But now the name on every tongue was Boone McAllister. The soldier who had once been a shadow in their town was suddenly the subject of speculation. Some praised his courage, others called it luck. One evening, Lila Rose sat in the kitchen of her oldest friend, Josie Bell Rollins, the town nurse. Josie Bell had carried her calm steadiness since high school, the same calm her patients clung to when illness came calling. At 35, Josie Bell Rollins was lean and tall, her auburn hair usually tied in a practical knot, her narrow face softened by warm hazel eyes. She wore her compassion as plainly as her gray cardigan, and people trusted her not only for her skill as a nurse, but for the way she truly listened. Life had carved sorrow into her, too. Her younger brother had died in a logging accident when she was still in her 20s, and since then she carried a quiet empathy for anyone whose grief felt too heavy to shoulder alone. Across the small kitchen table, Lila Rose McKenna sipped her tea, fingers tapping the rim of the cup. "He's kind to Ranger." I can see that she admitted softly. "But he's a stranger, Josie Bell. I don't know him. I don't know what shadows he carries." Josie Bell reached across the table, her long fingers brushing Lila Rose's wrist. "You of all people should know that shadows don't vanish just because we fear them. Sometimes they fade when something or someone casts a brighter light. Look at Ranger. He's calm with Boone McAllister, even safe. Maybe he's found the one he needs." Lila Rose's lips pressed tight, her late husband's memory flickering like a lantern in her chest. Before Wyatt McKenna grew too weak, he had whispered that the pup was meant to be more than company, meant to anchor her, give her something to hold when he no longer could. "But Ranger is mine," she whispered, as though saying it aloud might secure the bond. Josie Bell's smile was gentle. "He is yours. But maybe he can be more than that. Sometimes we save each other best when we share the weight." Those words lingered with Lila Rose long after she left her friend's cottage. Meanwhile, life at Boone's cabin began to shift in ways so small he almost missed them at first. He woke earlier, not to the hollow rhythm of old habits, but to the eager bark of Ranger waiting by the door. The silence that once pressed heavy inside the cabin now rang with the patter of paws across wooden planks. Ranger claimed the porch steps like a young sentinel, ears twitching, as if already learning the duty of watch. Boone found himself mending sagging fence posts, not out of compulsion, but because the pup needed safe ground to roam. He swept the porch, not caring if dust settled again tomorrow, and cooking turned into more than survival. He roasted meat, simmered stews, slicing portions small enough for a pup to share. More than once, Boone caught himself smiling at the sight of Ranger gnawing on Scrap's tail, thumping a steady rhythm. These were no longer the routines of a soldier, they were the rituals of a man reclaiming life. Of course, Redwood Ridge had its doubters. Old Jed Polk, leaning on his cane outside the mill, told anyone who'd listen that Boone had simply stumbled upon the pup and played the hero after. Others muttered that anyone could have tied a bandage. But little by little, their skepticism thinned. They saw Boone in the clearing, his tall frame lean and taut in faded camouflage movements, crisp and economical. Ranger at his side. Boone's low, firm voice giving simple commands. Sit, stay, heel. At first, the pup wobbled clumsy and eager. Then, with growing confidence, his ears perked, his tail held steady. Boone knelt to rub the dog's ears when he succeeded, and Ranger pressed against his leg in wordless devotion. One afternoon, a group of schoolboys drawn by Daisy May Carter's dramatic retellings crept close to the trees to watch. They whispered wide-eyed as Ranger dropped at a single gesture, then bounded forward and stopped on command as though reading Boone's mind. The boys ran back into town, swearing it wasn't luck at all. Boone McAllister's training that pup like a soldier, they said. And just like that, the talk shifted. Doubt gave way to respect. Folks who once turned their eyes now gave him a nod. One word carried further than the rest: redemption. Lila Rose noticed the change too whenever she visited. At first, she lingered stiffly on the porch, arms crossed, watching Boone and Ranger move together in quiet rhythm. But with each visit, her guard lowered. She saw the way Boone's stern face eased when the pup curled into his lap. She noticed the softening in his gray-blue eyes when Ranger barked at Daisy May Carter's laughter. And she realized Boone wasn't just protecting the pup, Ranger was keeping him alive. One evening, as the sun spilled gold across the ridge, Lila Rose lingered longer than she meant to. She watched Boone coax Ranger into sitting by the porch rail, his voice quiet, patient, free of the sharpness she once expected. For the first time in years, Lila Rose McKenna felt her chest ease, as if grief might finally be shared, instead of carried alone. By late afternoon, the wind shifted through Redwood Ridge, bringing the sharp scent of pine sap and wood smoke down from the ridge. A hush settled over the clearing, where Boone McAllister's cabin stood, broken only by the scrape of tools against wood as he straightened a leaning fence post. Ranger, stronger now on his legs, lounged across the porch boards. His bandaged paw had healed his clumsy gait, giving way to balance and strength. His coat shone black and gray in the last light, his golden-brown eyes never straying far from Boone. To anyone passing by, it was clear this wasn't just a soldier and a pup. This was a bond carved in silence, unspoken, but undeniable. It was then that Lila Rose appeared at the edge of the dirt path. She carried herself with a mixture of resolve and hesitation, grief, woven into every line of her tall, graceful frame. Silver strands in her dark hair caught the autumn light, making her look older than she was, though sorrow had aged her more than time ever could. Ranger saw her first. He scrambled up, tail wagging furiously, bounding forward with the joy only dogs carry. Lila Rose bent quickly, gathering him into her arms, pressing her face into his fur. "I've missed you, my boy," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ranger licked her collarbone, whimpering into her shoulder. But when she tried to turn away with him, his body stiffened. He twisted claws, scraping at the ground, eyes locked on Boone. The pup barked sharply, then again, urgent, pleading. Boone stood still by the fence, his gray-blue eyes steady, jaw tight, but his posture calm. He wiped his hands on a rag and stepped forward, closing the distance without rushing. "He's yours," Boone said simply, his voice even, but carrying weight. "I won't keep what doesn't belong to me." Lila Rose glanced down. Ranger whined and strained toward Boone, tail thumping wildly, body trembling with confusion. Her chest tightened. The memory of Wyatt McKenna's last words came back, his voice weak from illness, telling her to let the pup choose his own path. Tears stung her eyes. Slowly she crouched and set Ranger on the ground. At once, he bolted toward Boone, pressing against his leg with joyous barks. Boone's hand came down steady and protective, resting on the pup's head. "You saved him," Lila Rose whispered, her voice breaking. "And maybe in some way you saved me too. I held on so tightly because he was the last piece of my husband I had left. But maybe he was meant to bring me here." Her words faltered, but her eyes stayed locked on Boone. "He should stay with you." For a long moment, Boone said nothing. He looked down at Ranger, then back at her, his hardened face softening with something unspoken. "I'll do right by him," he said quietly. The promise held the weight of a vow forged in war. From the edge of the clearing, another voice broke the stillness. Silas Boone, the old park ranger, stepped out of the trees. Broad-shouldered even at 60, his beard streaked with white, his eyes sharp beneath the brim of his weathered hat. "You know, Boone," he said steadily, "you didn't just save a dog that day." His gaze cut through the air like wind off the mountain. "You saved yourself too. You just didn't realize it yet." Boone's eyes flicked toward the older man, then back to Ranger, whose tail thumped against his boot. And for the first time in years, something in Boone's chest loosened relief, fragile, but real. Lila Rose wiped her tears, straightening her shoulders. She looked at Boone one last time, before turning toward town, her steps lighter, now sorrow mingled with hope. The clearing grew quiet again, broken only by Ranger's bark of contentment and the whisper of pines swaying overhead. Seasons passed, and Redwood Ridge shifted with them. A full year had gone by since the morning when a frightened pup was lifted from the path of a train. And in that year the town had changed its people softer, its rhythm gentler. At the heart of it all was the unlikely bond between a battle-worn Marine and the GermanShepherd pup who had refused to let go. On a crisp autumn morning, the people of Redwood Ridge gathered by the tracks that cut through the tall pines. Children in wool sweaters clung to their parents' hands. Old men leaned on canes, and mothers carried baskets of apples and fresh bread wrapped in cloth, simple offerings for the small festival born from a story of rescue and redemption. At the heart of the crowd stood a bronze statue, newly unveiled, a Marine, kneeling arms wrapped protectively around a young GermanShepherd pup, forever frozen in the moment that had changed everything. The artist was Amos Holloway, a traveling sculptor who had wandered into Redwood Ridge after hearing the tale in a roadside diner. Broad-shouldered, with sandy hair streaked with gray, and hands rough from decades of work, Amos had shaped the metal with surprising tenderness. He had studied photographs, listened to Daisy May Carter's excited retellings, and walked the tracks himself, before casting the monument now gleaming in the morning light. At the base, a plaque read, "To the one who crossed the tracks with gratitude." It was more than a tribute to courage. It was a testament to second chances. Boone McAllister stood near the statue posture, straight as ever, though the hardness in his face had softened over the past year. His gray-blue eyes, once guarded as stone, now carried warmth when they met the gazes of his neighbors. The camouflage jacket he wore seemed less like armor and more like a memory. Beside him sat Ranger, no longer the trembling pup of that fog-choked morning, but a strong yearling shepherd. His black and gray coat gleamed, his chest had broadened, and his eyes shone with the loyalty that bound him to Boone. Ranger's devotion never wavered. Even in celebration, he leaned lightly against Boone's leg-tail, swishing in a calm rhythm. From the crowd, Daisy Mae Carter darted forward, now 8 years old, her freckles glowing as she threw her arms around Ranger's neck. "He's so big now," she exclaimed, her laughter bright as she looked up at Boone with awe. Boone's rare chuckle slipped free, his hand resting on her small shoulder. Nearby, Josie Belle Rollins stood with Lila Rose McKenna. The two women had grown close over the past year, sharing resilience tea by the fire and long talks about healing. Josie's calm steadiness balanced Lila Rose's quiet grief, though her hazel eyes now carried more light than sorrow. Lila Rose never regretted leaving Ranger in Boone's care. She visited often, bringing baskets of bread or small gifts, and in return found not only Ranger's joyful welcome, but Boone's steady companionship. When Boone spoke at the ceremony, his voice carried strong and even across the hush of the crowd. "I didn't do this alone," he said, brushing a hand across Ranger's head. "This little one made his choice. He chose to live. He chose to trust. And in doing that, he taught me how to do the same. I came here to hide from what war had taken from me, but instead I found a reason to stand again. Not as a soldier, but as a neighbor, as a man, as a friend." The words drew tears to many eyes, nods of agreement rippling through the crowd. When the speeches ended, the townsfolk lingered, sharing food, telling stories, and letting the weight of the day settle into memory. Silas Boone, older now, and leaning on his walking stick, teased Boone about finally joining the living. Boone only smiled a rare, genuine smile, while Ranger lay at his feet, ears alert, eyes content. Children played near the statue, imitating the Marines kneel, their laughter mingling with the rustle of autumn leaves. By then, Boone and Ranger's story had already become folklore, a tale told in classrooms, church pews, and over lunches at the mill. It wasn't just about a rescue anymore. It was about how courage and loyalty could mend a broken man and a town along with him. As the sun dipped low, painting the ridge in amber and crimson, Boone stood beside the bronze likeness Ranger at his heel, watching the people he had once kept at arm's length. The weight of solitude he'd carried since leaving the battlefield no longer pressed him down. Instead, he felt anchored by something steadier, something lasting. Redwood Ridge would be remembered not just for its misty mornings and iron tracks, but as the place where a battle-worn Marine and a stray pup had redefined courage, proving that redemption could come on 4 paws. Sometimes the greatest miracles aren't loud or bright. Sometimes they arrive quietly like a trembling pup, finding the arms of a man who needed saving just as much. And so Boone's story and Ranger's became more than memory. They became a reminder that no one is ever too lost to be found, no heart too broken to heal, and no life too far gone for second chances.